And just before I introduce our esteemed panelists who will take this to the next level for us, I wanted to add just a little bit of provocation to my remarks. And the provocation is, as I think of ESG, one of the things that I've thought of, and especially as it relates to anti-corruption, is that maybe what we're talking about is ESJ. And why J? J is justice. J to me is a order of magnitude above governance. Governance to me is a definition of what rules you need to be compliant, whereas justice to me is about values and ethics and one order above. And so as we're thinking about this, I'd just like to get your reaction, and I'm not the first one to say this, but this is how it ties into Sustainable Development Goals and Goal 16 in particular, and how justice is really a way to apply, if you think about it, it applies to the rest of ESG. We talk about climate justice. We talk about racial and intersectional justice. We talk about economic justice and inclusivity. We talk about honesty and transparency. We talk about all these notions, which are really notions of justice, under the framework of governance. So I want you to think big and be a little bit provocative in your own questions, if we can do that. So with that, I do want to start to introduce the panelists, because we want to continue that discussion. And true to, I think, the themes of this conference, we have a multi-sector panel. We have people representing business, NGOs, academia, because we all know that we have to work together if we're going to get anything done. And while we don't have anyone directly related to the public sector, we do have people who have served in the public sector, so I assume they'll jump in. So I'm going to ask the panelists to kind of keep their remarks to short, a little bit under 5 minutes, and then I'm going to ask a question of each of them that features their expertise. And then we're going to do some discussion, and then the rest of this is going to be open to you. And if those people who are watching online, we want to take your questions as well, and if you send them in, we have people in the room who are monitoring the chats, and we'll try to be as inclusive as possible in the time we have. So Hentie Dirker is the Chief ESG and Integrity Officer at SNC-Lavalin, and he's responsible for the firm's overall compliance and posture and infrastructure, with the goal of creating a program that's recognized as a benchmark for what he's doing. And I know this is a company that's been through a lot, and Hentie, we're anxious to hear from you about what you've been able to accomplish. And then maybe I should just go one at a time then, and then as I introduce you, because you're not in the same order, so which is fine. It's fine. It's just I don't want the audience to get confused. So, so Hentie, what is the key motivation in pursuing Chief Integrity Officer role? And I know that the World Economic Forum put out a paper about creating Chief Integrity Officers, and there seems to be a proliferation. So how does this function work, and does it help create a culture of integrity in an organization?
Sure, thanks, Margery, and I'm happy to be here. Yeah, sustainability, and on your question of governance and justice, my knee-jerk reaction is, with proper governance, the outcome will be justice. So that's just on a side note. Chief ESG and Integrity Officer, new role at our company. I've been the Chief Compliance Officer, Chief Integrity Officer for about 6-7 years. The company had some issues pre-2012. So I think that's one of the areas that, that we can also park on the side. As a company that's gone through a scandal, have put a lot of effort into establishing proper governance around everything that they do. So companies that's gone through that, I think is one step ahead in terms of having proper governance, or the G from an ESG perspective. Sustainability typically in companies sits on its own, maybe under marketing or communications. It was no different from our perspective. And then the board and the CEO kind of realized that we have to make sure that whatever we put out is factual, is transparent, is auditable. And they looked at what we've been able to accomplish from a compliance or integrity program perspective, and especially making sure that there's adequate training, awareness, communication, and controls around everything that we do. And so they approached me and say, can you replicate what we've done from an integrity perspective, from an ESG perspective? So now I see myself as a chief cat herder, because I think in companies, it's really herding cats when it comes to ESG, because you've got all these different silos across the company that cumulatively gives you your ESG or sustainable storyline, but you have to make sure that there's alignment. And now with all the disclosure and reporting frameworks that you have to make sure that whatever they provide to the sustainability reporting team, that those figures and metrics and disclosures is actually audited or by a limited assurance, reliable assurance, because in the end it lands up into your financial or annual reports. So for me, just to kind of summarize, is ESG sustainability, it's not a new thing, but it's the way of, I think, how companies need to think of how to approach it and trying to leverage what they already have in place, which we've done from an integrity perspective, because it's all about doing the right thing. If you want to be a sustainable company, everything you do should be according to that and to your purpose from a company perspective. So a really fun place to be, and very happy to be here and share the platform with the rest of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. And keeping with the business side of this first, to kind of set a stage, I'd like to call on Klaus Moosmayer, who's the Chief Ethics and Risk and Compliance Officer for Novartis. And Klaus is quite famous among the community for transforming ethics, risk, and compliance at Novartis in the same way the company is reimagining medicine by pursuing innovation, using data and digital, and unleashing creative power of employees and ethics into the core business. And so it'd be very interesting also to hear from you. And I would just note that I gather you were the first head of compliance for a company that was invited to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. So it's an uplift for all of us working in this field to know that there's interest at that level. So can you walk us through the integrity journey that Novartis has had? And you're there 4 years, but you're on the executive committee. So I think you have a really interesting view of what this journey is like.
Yeah, thank you, Margery. Let's stay humble, first of all, and put this into the context. And by the way, the speech to the intervention at the General Assembly was indeed, this was my former job at Siemens, Chief Compliance Officer, quite impactful. I mean, the hall was half empty, to be honest, just to put this into the context. But nevertheless, it was the first time business compliance could speak there. So after 18 years, while I left Siemens, which is a fantastic company that turned around in compliance, and entered the pharmaceutical industry, which was before the pandemic the lowest regarding industry. I mean, only I think the US government was in the rankings lower than the pharma industry in the published rankings. Is because I think the pharma industry is rightfully so one of the most watched and criticized industry. Why? Because it's the industry that's a good thing, the purpose, which is the closest industry to human life and health and science. On the other hand, it's for profit, which is a dilemma we have to acknowledge per se. Because if you talk about life and health and money, it's a very uncomfortable feeling for all of us. Mm-hmm. But this is the challenge which I believe we need to face, because to develop a medicine takes 10 to 15 years, costs 1 to 2 billion. We pay this all of our own pockets as a company. And most of the medicine development fails because you can't force science. We have roughly 10,000 diseases in this world and not more than 2,000 medicines. That's an interesting way. So it's a world full of ethical dilemmas, and therefore the title of Ethics, Risk and Compliance Office, I come to ESG in a second, it's very, very closely linked. You can't escape ethical dilemmas in the pharma industry. Maybe you can't escape it in other industries as well. Other colleagues should maybe judge on this, but you can't escape this in the pharmaceutical industry, because everything what you do from early research, bioethics, a huge topic, how far can you go in cell and gene therapy, for example, to manufacturing topics, to commercializing topics, everything has ethical questions. On the other hand, we are one of the most regulated industries, rightfully so. So all what you do in ethics, risk, and compliance has to be super good in operational excellence, because we are regulated from top to down. The big opportunity I saw at Novartis was to bring this ethics, comprehensive global risk management and compliance together. Because what we do at Novartis is we have a risk area which comprises the whole enterprise, includes crisis management and business continuity management. So if you ask who coordinates our response to the war of Russia and Ukraine, that's us in my function. We do this, the same as the pandemic coordination. And this is so close related to compliance question, corruption question, ethical question, that we believe this is very impactful. And we make this a strong function in the company. Not perfect, we are on the deferred prosecution agreement. It's also a noble task for new management under our CEO, Vasna Simham, that took over a little bit before I joined the company, to clean up the past and stay humble, because accident happens. We publish every year the numbers of compliance investigation we have and sanctions we need to employ, because we are part of society, and there's no perfection. There's no perfection there. And finally, about ESG, which is closely linked to the pharma purpose. Yes, we have to be good corporate citizens in environment, absolutely, and governance, this is very close to ethics, risk, and compliance, anti-corruption, but the biggest ESG topic for us is access to medicine for patients, which is a big topic, and definitely we're also not there where we should be in this world. So if we do this regularly, our materiality assessments about ESG impact, the number one topic is access to medicines and ethical standards. Thank you.
Just before we leave the topic, I wondered if there's any best practice or lessons, and maybe we can come back to everybody on this, but and you're trying to bring these functions together, which I agree is probably one of the biggest challenges as we've looked at companies on this journey. The functions within ESG are spread across the whole company. I think you also mentioned this. So in your effort to pull this together, what do you see as the major obstacles?
Yeah, so two things I want to mention. The first one is very tangible, very practical, but it's important. I mean, to have impact in an organization, may it be a public or private, there's not much of a difference. Of course, you have to be pragmatic, a problem solver, but you need a mandate. And this is often the issue of colleagues who work on anti-corruption topics. They have a very limited mandate. They are in a silo. They don't have really an impact in the company. So if you want to build a holistic ethics, risk, and compliance approach to tackle these topics, you need a mandate. And therefore, we said at Novartis, we put this in the executive committee level. I have a mandate to do this. And because if not, it's super difficult to get a huge organization with more than 100,000 associates behind this. And again, it's not perfect. This is all on a journey. I also want to call this out. Secondly, you have to really mobilize the employees, what we call the associates in the organization. So when we did the new code of ethics in the pandemic, we said we go for a crowdsourcing, collaborative approach, use behavioral science to get the full company activated for the code of ethics and for the time afterwards. I think you have to do both, the clear organizational empowerment, Margery, but also the culture at the end will make the difference. If you publish one policy more or less, it will not move the needle, to be honest. The culture is a difficult animal. It's decades potentially you will need to work on this. But these are the two topics I would like to highlight.
Yeah, and I think, Hentie, when we come back later, I think it'd be interesting to talk about how that impacted what you've had to do to change a culture that was a little bit at risk to get back together. But one of the things I'd like to do now is to turn to the NGO sector and what happens in non-governmental organizations. And you know, Delia, first of all, thank you for being our host. I think we all should thank Delia.
You're welcome.
As the chair of Transparency International, she and her team have really put an outstanding program together. And I think the way these different topics come together causes us all to think, and hopefully we'll leave here with a much better sense of perspective of how we work together. So on that topic, can you talk a little bit about how you see what the role civil society can play in raising the bar on anti-corruption, but doing it in the context of this greater purpose and society, and not lose the focus on our G?
Yeah, thank you very much, Margery. It's a pleasure, and welcome again, all of you, to the IACC. And you know, from Transparency International, we want to emphasize this collective action endeavor. We cannot do this alone. You cannot do it from the private sector alone. Neither can governments.
I'm just going to pull it down.
Okay.
A little bit, so.
Excellent. Thank you, Margery. So we have to work together. That's why we have had panels with lots of business people talking here in order to start a real conversation, not for civil society to give lessons or ask for particular conduct on business, but to work together, elaborate together this integrity culture. And this all started with our call for integrity beyond compliance, because we agree with you. We are in a moment where we have to restart, and I said it in my opening words, the conversation about culture, about values, about purpose. And this, of course, has to do not only with the ESGs or the companies or the compliance function evolving to integrity or ethics officer. It has to do with the approach that we have had in terms of anti-corruption. 30 years ago, when we started working on anti-corruption, the main trend in terms of theories in this respect was the neo-institutionalism, which says, okay, you have to work on norms, rules, laws, institutions, agencies, create that, and the problem is solved. And whoever dared talk about ethics or integrity or the word culture was really treated as a dilettante. You are not part of this conversation, so please stop talking nonsense. We have to reverse that, because we are talking now in the business sector about purpose, about the public value of the company, about values. And the ESG interpret in that way authorize us to put the anti-corruption within the G, and the G within the complete framework of sustainability. And this includes this integrity culture. If one word I would like to highlight is the need to change the culture. And it takes a lot of effort and a long time. But if we don't start, we will never get there. So in order to avoid the silos walk in companies, we have to talk about culture. And we have to talk about coherence or consistency. It is impossible to have excellent rules, very nice codes of conduct, all the policies in place, the training, the sanctions, the monitoring. But if the company says A and behave like B, we have a problem, a big, big problem in terms of trust. And we have seen lots of examples. Within rules or policies in the company, for instance, the ethic codes and all the anti-corruption things, and then the incentives policy of the company completely approaching the incentives in other way. Or the rules and the principles and the declaration of companies, and then the behavior of companies going in other ways. And I have a very beautiful example that all students capture in a minute. One or two of the big accountant companies in the world were fined here in the United States because they cheat in the examinations for certifications of their employees. Okay, so what's about the wonderful code of ethics they have when they cheat in the exams for the certification of their employees? So this consistency is as important as the rules and the policies that the company creates. And this has to do with the culture of integrity.
Thank you. And so if we take this to the next level, Gabriel Cecchini, you're a consultant now. You were in the public
Yes.
sector, but so you see these companies and they come to you for help. And so how do you make sure that the things that have been mentioned already get incorporated? What advice do you give them to help them move along? And how do we make sure that they maybe can join together in some collective action to move things forward?
Well, thank you. I think one important aspect of it, I mean, we have been talking about the G in ESG. I think it's perfectly aligned with what Delia said. It's the I in ESG, no? Look and the oversight of these ESG commitments that the company has with their key stakeholders, and how we are able to meet them, these commitments, no? And whenever there is a large gap between what a company, as Delia said also, between what a company does and the actual impact of the company, there we have a problem. So it's important for companies to understand this, that integrity is cross-cutting. It's like it's something that should be taken into account in assessing the performance of the company related to the S and the E dimensions as well. Within integrity, and we have developed this in a couple of papers in the Anti-Corruption Council within the WEF, it's important to stress the fact that corruption risks are a material topic for all companies in all industries and sectors. There have been some reporting standards that somehow have put aside business ethics, and they don't consider it to be material. We understand that sometimes the definition of materiality is very limited, only thinking about investors, but we think that we have to think in a broader way, understanding materiality as in terms of double materiality, not only the risks that these issues have for the company in terms of the financial performance, legal risk, reputational risks, but also the externalities, no? The negative impacts that the company has in their environments. So from that point of view, I mean, corruption has since the beginning been a double materiality issue, no? Because we know that it affects companies and also communities, and there is the misuse of public resources and all the things that we know. So I think that's a critical aspect, and in one of the papers, we summarize the main factors that should be taken into account in terms of governance factors and sub-factors in assessing companies' ESG performance. And of course, the big elephant in the room is ESG washing, no? Whenever companies are saying they're doing one thing and in fact they're doing something completely different, I think it's key for companies to understand that nowadays scrutiny about their actions is as high as it ever has been, and there are many data available that can be used by investors and banks and civil society organizations to monitor companies and what the real impact is on the community. So the place to hide, is less and less. There is less margin to not to be aligned with what you're saying you're doing. So
well, it's interesting too, because in the U.S. anyway, the Securities and Exchange Commission is putting together rules to make sure people are walking the talk and that they're not just saying things, but they're actually doing things, so there's teeth behind it. And then we also, I guess recently, there was the One Planet Summit that was in Abu Dhabi. That was all the big sovereign wealth companies coming together to talk about how important ESG is to the way they're making decisions about their own investments. So I think there is going to be continued scrutiny on this. And You know, I think the thing that's so interesting about the companies we have here is that they're doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because they have to. They will have to at some point. But I think as companies look at this and they're on a journey, where they start is all different ways on that journey. And what's important is all moving in the right direction. And so I hope we can learn from the experiences of the people who are farther along on that journey during the course of the rest of this discussion. So before we do that, there's one other part of the puzzle that we want to get to, if you will, and that's the academic side. And Anita Ramasastry is with us. She's the Henry Jackson Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law. And she's an expert in the fields of anti-corruption, but also commercial law, sustainable development, and business and human rights. So a very broad mandate. And I was hoping she could kind of look at this from an academic point of view. And in addition to maybe giving us a sense of some of the pressures, both positive and negative on ESG, maybe you could also comment on the J, because that is certainly within your remit.
Absolutely, yeah. And I was going to say, as an academic, I can just make things up, right, and sort of go to the high theory, and it doesn't really matter. But anyway, I want to thank you, Margery, but also thank the World Economic Forum and Katja Bechtel, who's here today, and her colleagues for putting this together. So let me give you a couple of suggestions. The first thing is just to remind ourselves, and I think, Gabriel, you did a good job of sort of reminding us kind of how are the things we're talking about actually factoring into this ESG world that we're all discussing. And just to remind you, I think what we're focusing on here are two different things. One is, as we talk about the G, what else needs to be baked into the G? That there's a discussion, even though we're having debates in different countries, including the United States, about whether ESG is something that is good or bad, there's already groups of people saying that we need more indicators and more things in the G, including looking at anti-corruption risk, or corruption risk, I should say, and then also the rule of law, right? So actually assessing rule of law in different markets. And so that's an open question for all of us. The World Justice Project has been focusing very much. They have the Rule of Law Index on doing this. The World Economic Forum and others have been really taking a deeper dive on the issue of corruption. So that's one thing for us all to talk about. We haven't seen that systematic integration yet. And the second thing, which we've heard about, especially from our private sector colleagues here today, is about integration, right? That the G is about what kind of integrated responsibility the board and senior management has in terms of risks in three different dimensions: risks to company, risk to people, and risk to planet, right? How should the board tackle those things in an integrated fashion, and how does ESG relate to that? And I'll say as an academic, one of the challenges is that while we're hearing about integration, right, chief ethics and integrity or chief integrity officers, what we haven't done yet is that in using ESG indicators as a way to communicate to the board is not systematic yet. That a lot of those indicators go in to whoever has that job within the company, whether it's a sustainability expert, a compliance expert, that they're the ones that make decisions based on the indicators, and maybe the board gets a snapshot of some of those things, but it's not there. So the question for all of us is not only what goes into the G, but if we think of G as being robust and needing to be integrated, how do we then say all of these indicators that we're creating on E, S, and G, what is the most meaningful way that they can be used to inform the board and help them fulfill their ethical and management responsibilities? That's, I think, a big challenge and question, and I think one that academics and the World Economic Forum and others can really drill down on a lot more. And I'll just stop and say, you know, over the past 6 years, even though I began my career as a banking lawyer dealing with like money that was stolen as a central banker and so corruption, I've spent the past 6 years in the world of business and human rights, which some of you in the room will know about. There was a whole forum in Geneva last week, and there's a whole movement to turn corporate connections to human rights violations into a compliance world. We have new laws coming on board in Europe, et cetera, around supply chains and responsibility of companies. But just to say, when I worked within government last around 2009, I went before senior government officials and I said, why should you think about, you already have and know about corruption risk and you have laws, and so you are really busy dealing with those, but why should you think about human rights at the same time? And I would often with a cabinet official or Secretary of State or Secretary of Commerce, you get 5 minutes maybe or 3. So I just put up a couple of slides where I said, let's look at companies that have been investigated for FCPA violations, right? One
Foreign
side.
Corrupt Practices Act for people
Foreign
who
Corrupt
aren't from the
Practices
US.
Act, right? So foreign bribery. But let's look at the companies that have investigated. And then I put up a second slide. And I say, let me show you companies that are now being sued by NGOs and civil society groups for the connection, even though they're multinational, might be headquartered one place, to human rights abuses somewhere in the world. And let's look at the companies. And the same companies that were being investigated for bribery were also now being accused of being very strongly connected to human rights abuses. And I said, perhaps this could mean that there's an issue of corporate culture, right? That we're seeing risk in these two places. So we didn't talk about ESG. I just used those 2 slides to say it's all connected. And so I think that's the larger message. It's all connected, and so if it's all connected, what needs to be in the G? And then how do we use these indicators to make the case to management and the board?
So I didn't mean this to be a partisan question, but I wondered, and you're all welcome to respond to this, but what is the answer for the governments or for the places, just here in the United States even, where there's pushback to ESG, maybe because of it's considered woke, maybe for other reasons, but what affirmative action can we take to have people understand this is beyond a partisan issue?
So I was told to say, first of all, that I'm a business and human rights lawyer, not an ESG lawyer, as a way of disclaiming any expertise. But so that's what. But I'll just say that it's just about educating people. The history of ESG. Remember again, ESG is just about indicators, right? It's data. And that data was originally generated for socially responsible investment, right? That there's still a community of investors out there that want to make specific ethical decisions. So that's point 1. The second point, which is where we're seeing, I think, this debate is about, can larger institutional investors that are investing money more broadly use these indicators to make decisions? And the question is there going to be somehow a less profitable return for those investors, let's say you're a retiree and a pension fund. And I think that's a matter of the experts who have done the research really demonstrating why it's material, right? So even beyond what Gabriel mentioned of double materiality is the fact that in certain areas, and I'm not a climate expert, but again, there's enough academic and research around the materiality of these different indicators. So I think that's the issue, is to say this is not partisan. There's actual reason for why a BlackRock is making a specific decision with a certain number of its funds, and I think I'll leave it at that. But Gabriel, I don't know if you have other thoughts?
Yes, no, I think it's, I think it's important to, when we talk about the G in ESG, not only think about companies, but also think about the investment chain, no? To start with asset owners, central banks, the sovereign wealth funds, pension funds at the state level, and also then the asset managers, no? That they're the ones who invest in equities, in fixed income, private equity firms, and they need to really have the G well designed and well implemented in order to make sure that they're investing and promoting, sustainable companies. We have a very recent example from an asset management arm of a big German bank whose sustainability officer was fired because she didn't want to approve the reporting of the information, so the quantity of funds that were assessed based on ESG criteria, and she didn't accept that, and because of that she was fired, and then when the case became public and the authorities in Germany and the US started to act. But that's a key issue, how investment management firms are really taking this seriously, and how they are really integrating through many strategies, negative screenings, which seems to be historically the most classical way of integrating ESG factors, but then you have positive screenings, you have ESG integration, and you have stewardship. Of course, we have the example of the Norwegian pension fund, the sovereign wealth fund that has been a leader in the field, setting the stage for a good assessment of companies in terms of ESG factors, especially on anti-corruption, and they have made public their policies on that.
So the people that I've talked to, whether they're at the you know, the sovereign wealth level or others, I think are fairly well convinced at this point that this is good, it's good for business. It's not just something nice to do. And I just wondered, in terms, Hentie and Klaus, from your experience in your companies, has this been a struggle to convince people of the cost benefit? Or is it obvious now that, that putting these things in place actually helps business?
Maybe I can start. I think it's all about making sure that whatever you do is material to your business. You know, under the ESG umbrella, or, you know, even looking at the SDGs, there's a lot of things out there. Not all companies can touch and have a material effect on all of those areas. So I think, you know, and as Klaus mentioned, you know, as a company, you have to understand what's material to us from a business perspective and where can we really affect change. And once you do that assessment, you actually realize that it should align with your business strategy. If it doesn't, you've got a problem. So all of that should align, which kind of makes it much easier then from a business perspective to drive that change or drive the improvement. From our company perspective, we've got a really cool purpose. Our purpose is to engineer a better future for the planet and its people. So as an engineering, design, construction company, you know, we're really in a unique place that we can help the world to become a better place from a sustainable perspective. So for us, the biggest impact is not as a professional services kind of company looking at our own carbon footprint and all of that, but it's really about how can we help our clients reduce their greenhouse gas emissions? How can we help them be more sustainable? How can we help them when we do projects for them to limit the community impacts and things like that? So I think it's all about, from a business perspective, understanding where can you affect change, and then through the business, and the employees is completely engaged with that, because employees nowadays wants to work for a company that has a clear purpose.
So before we go on to Klaus, when you're describing all these different things that you're helping your clients do, or do you also look at the governance piece of this, or is it just about the content of the, whether it's climate or something else?
No, it's all about the governance piece as well. And you know, as we've gone through, and we're on a journey, so by no means we're an expert or, you know, far down the road. In speaking to our stakeholders, to our shareholders, you know, one of the biggest things that they want to see companies such as us report on is, if you're saying you're making an impact towards your clients, what is that impact? If you're saying you do a lot of work from a sustainable business, what is your revenue on that from a sustainable perspective? So making sure from a governance perspective we have all the controls in place so that we can track that and then report on that. I think it just all links back to your business strategy. So it's really going back to the drawing board, looking at that's our purpose. These are the market strategies that we have. What do we need to kind of measure to show that our market strategies and business strategy leads towards the purpose from a company perspective, and being able to report on that.
Klaus?
Can I be a little bit provocative, or is this
Please.
forbidden? So everything what Hentie said, I would subscribe. The purpose of the company, I mean, how can you attract young talents if you are not talking about these topics in companies and put this at the forefront? I think this is clear. The struggle, what you mentioned, is the system is broken. The system is broken. I mean, we did a fun, not a fun job, but starting how many standards in ESG you have around the world. We stopped counting by 50. I mean, how many rating agencies who are measuring us for investors, for money, who also are, by the way, revolving doors advisory companies as well. They all have different standards. No company on earth can comply with all of them. If we would do it, we would convert into a ESG bureaucracy monster. Only checklists. Only seeing, okay, this environmental standard asks for this target is here. So in principle, I applaud that we come to a regulation. It's strange that companies ask for regulation. Normally we are asking for regulation, but this craziness has to stop. It's also, by the way, I mean, again, the analysts and the rating agencies have a good purpose to be, but they need to be regulated as well because they impact share price with their ratings. That's an industry. It's an industry of its own. If it's done transparently and well, this is useful. So don't get me wrong, but this is a crazy world at the moment. So it has to be regulated in a dialogue. What's happening in Europe at the moment, the regulation comes, the dialogue, I would say very carefully, can be improved with the business on ESG reporting. And then, of course, we ourselves have to do our job. If we go back to the G for our topic, I mean, anti-bribery, there, for example, there was nothing out. I mean, there was nothing. So we said, okay, this came from one investor, from Norges Bank Investment Management, one of the biggest investors worldwide. They said, let's sit together, a round table, and the Basel Institute facilitated this. Let's come with indicators for anti-bribery. I mean, reporting and disclosure came to 17 KPIs. You can say, are these the right ones? But we published them. I mean, we were one of the first companies to publish our anti-bribery report. Not perfect, but this is a nice also, I mean, showcase that if investors and industry talk, we can come to meaningful outputs on the G pillar as well.
So why don't we take this one step further, and Delia, you might have some ideas from, from being with a civil society organization, which drove a lot of this to begin with. But what if we were to try to fix the broken system? What is within our power to do as a group? You represent a lot of great minds in a lot of different areas. What could we do?
I think we have to start dialoguing. The dialogue should be there because it must be collective action. And there are certain principles that can help. Of course, we are asking for transparency, for information. And I remember one PACI meeting when there was a survey online, you remember? And we asked the PACI community, all anti-corruption converted and convinced and committed people. Do you report about your rules to prevent corruption? No, 5% or something like that. Do you report on the cases that you have had, as you mentioned, Klaus? Very little. And this was the converted community. Imagine the rest. So we need transparency. We need to, or we can, from civil society, and that's what we did with the Global Future Council, helping what should be in the G. Because the G is not only how many committees are in the board or how inclusive the board of the company is, but for instance, it should include the report on lobbying, on campaign finances, on donors, on gifts. I know it's a lot to ask, but for us, having that kind of information should or could help us to do our job in holding power to account afterwards. And if companies really are committed to ESG as a sustainable thing, not just the reporting exercise, as Klaus says, why not tell us something else? Not only we are committed to democracy and avoiding undue influence. No, tell us, how are you doing lobbying? Who are you giving gifts? How are you financing campaigns? And help us with transparency to hold power to account.
I think that what Klaus is saying, though, is that right now 1,000 flowers have bloomed. And you have to pick and choose which of these reports you're going to do, or all you will do is reports. Yeah. And so, that's what's broken here, is that we have not agreed on a scheme where everybody can evaluate the same things. And if we could, maybe we'll come back to this in a minute, but I want to make sure that any of the other panelists want to jump in on this. Okay. do we want to, I'm going to stop for a minute. I can keep going here, but I want to make sure that there's time from the audience, and if there are questions that you want to raise. Yes, sir.
This question...
Could you just identify yourself for everybody?
Sorry, yeah. Don Griswold with the Digital Economist and Tech for Transparency. Should I talk into that? Don Griswold with the Digital Economist and Tech for Transparency. Question is going to be for Klaus, and it relates to, Delia, to your theme at the beginning, a call to create a culture of integrity. And this question is very personal to me. A year ago, I left a 3-decade-long career as a tax avoidance enabler. I built a 600-person tax minimization shop at one of the big 4 firms, built on creating and exploiting legal loopholes that are a foundation of the hidden economy. I went on to become executive tax counsel at Berkshire Hathaway. A year ago, I chucked it all and saw the light. Don't know how after all those years. But my question is this. In the Big 4, which is the architecture, the foundation of secrecy and corruption and avoidance, some good stuff too, but that is what they do. They create it for the good, and then it's used by the bad, and it's all mixed up. The question is, in a culture like that, where it's all about ego, it's all, can my brain beat yours? May the smartest person win. That is what tax avoidance is for the enabling community. Klaus, how do we change that culture when it's based on appeals to ego? How do we do it?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, first of all, I thank you for your openness and for the emotion, what we all see. I mean, I'm carefully positive on this topic. Why? Because, I mean, the topic of tax avoidance is definitely at the table, right? I mean, if you look at the work the OECD did on digital taxation, I mean, our headquarters in Switzerland, so you can imagine, I mean, the Swiss country also has to make a decision. They committed as a country to fulfill the OECD new taxation rule going forward. I'm still curious what the US position finally will be there, to have a kind of taxation rules which applies to all of the countries. Then secondly, it's sometimes, you know, a little bit a clash of integrity topics. And I give a very actual example. So beneficial ownership, definitely, and secrecy there is one of the biggest, I mean, loopholes for tax avoidance, corruption, whatever. So since years, we all go for beneficial ownership registers. And I myself, I made a change. I was, at the beginning, not for public access to these registers. I changed my mind. I said, I think if you want a level playing field, it has to be public. Of course. Now, the European Court of Justice, a couple of days ago, said that's illegal. And, data privacy rules of especially family-owned businesses who are afraid of extortion and blackmailing have to be taken into account. I'm not here to say this is wrong. That's the decision of the highest court in Europe. I mean, we have to discuss this as a team. But sometimes, if you want to attack this structurally, I mean, your question, how to attack this structurally? You have to have this dialogue. Which values do we have there? But positively, again, I believe the topic is on the agenda. And institutions like the OECD did a great job to make this more transparent and more effective.
And if I may, on this topic, yeah, I have said to the press that the decision of the court has destroyed in one day years of work in terms of beneficial ownership transparency. Because immediately after the decision, some other countries, the decision has to do with Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, and immediately some other countries has closed their registers. They are not longer accessible for the public. And really, if you read the sentence, the decision, from the legal point of view, it's perfect. The problem is that the situation has changed. So having written, my first book was on privacy right in the 80s, imagine. And of course, in that context, there was a complete study on what were the limits for privacy, because privacy is not an absolute right. For instance, famous personalities or the VIPs have a lower threshold of protection because of their own acts in terms of the legality. And there were other limits in that time that were analyzed, studied, etc. And the decision of the court is excellent, old-fashioned. Why? Because nowadays, the public interest that should allow a lower threshold includes, for instance, anti-money laundering, which is, of course, a problem of illicit financial flows, insecurity, kleptocrats around the world, et cetera, et cetera. So we need, and we were talking with Nicola Bonucci, another colleague from PAGI, we need not only to have the political arguments against this decision or in favor of beneficial ownership, transparency, and public accessible register. We have also to create the appropriate legal doctrines that allow a juridical court, a legal court, to sustain other things. Because now the public interest includes new limitations for privacy. And of course the court has no that doctrine, has political statements, has civil society saying things, or OGP, or everyone, but not the sustainable arguments to go further in a new way of interpreting privacy. That's something we have to do.
Anita, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just I can speak loud again, I teach. So on the ego question, I just want to say that enablers as a group, right, professional service providers, we have talked about them as sort of generic, sort of ambiguous, amorphous entities. There are people and there are firms. And so the next wave, right, is calling out and making the connection of who the enablers are and what they do, right? And that's another piece of that.
And another panel immediately after this.
Okay. You know, there is one other
marketing is important.
There's one other part of the of what you're saying about having these having the transparency, and it's kind of what you were saying, what you were all saying about these are choices, value choices, because in some cases it's you know, we talked a lot about Russia in this whole conference, but you know, in some cases their desire to have that information is for illicit purposes themselves. So, you know, not every state's a good actor either. So these things are very complicated. I think we would all agree. There were some other questions, so let's get to a couple more and then we'll come back. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
If you're behind the post and you have a question, well, maybe I can move, but...
you can't see me on the other side, Lupila. Hello, Delia. Hi, I'm Ulrik Åsöv, I'm chair of TI Sweden. I was going to ask a question about the investors that you have engaged in and how you make that sustainable over time and that there are more investors actually working on anti-corruption or the G as in a wider context. But because I'll give an example. We have a business integrity forum. It's been there for 10 years. We just had a 10-year anniversary, so we're very happy about that. And there are a lot of companies joining us. So that's working out pretty well. And they're still performing well. Then we have problems of foreign bribery, obviously still in Sweden, with big companies not adhering to certain things. I'm not going to mention the companies here today. But what we have done, another thing, is to actually form an investors integrity forum. So we have now 7 investors, large institutional investors. It's not a flower yet. It's just a seed that we planted, and it's growing a bit. And we have the pension fund, one of the largest ones, and then we have insurance companies and so on and so forth. So my question is how to involve them wider, because we're learning right now, and it's a fairly steep learning curve at this point. Thank you.
I can start, and you have a wealth of experience as well. I mean, first of all, and I speak very frequently to ESG investors. It's interesting. I mean, it's at the moment, I would say, still a myth that we have real ESG investment. It's simply a fact. I'm hopeful this will change. I mean, let's see how the US situation will develop, but Europe definitely will foster this. But let's face it, it's not real an ESG investment. But the interest is there, and I applaud this. So what we do, I think there's a lot of proactiveness needed. And we just held a couple of days ago. We do regular ESG investor calls and briefings, and we do one annual ESG investor day, only focused on ESG. So I speak there, my CEO, and others, and we are just, it's a little bit of presentation, but it's basically also Q&A, and just to listen to the investor, what are your burning topics at the moment? And for us, it's a lot about access, which is right, about pricing, access, environment, and I would love to see more questions around ethics, to be honest. But there is, like Norges is a prime example that you really lead the pack, I would say. But there's also on the investor side, to make the G more tangible, and we have to help them potentially, to make the G more tangible is still a way to go. But as a company, you can be proactive, you should be proactive, not as a marketing, but as a listening to the investors as well, and this is what we try to do. But Hentie, you have...
Yeah, and exactly the same. I think, you know, as a company, one of the first things we've done is going out to our major investors and say, what do you want to see more of from us? Where's their gaps? And making sure, because again, you know, going back to the reporting frameworks and the rating agencies, is what's important for you from an investment perspective. And I, you know, when I started my role, I got very good advice from somebody, John Drimmer, that's sitting there in the back, is, you know, especially from a rating agency perspective, is you can't focus on all of them. You know, find out which ones could be important to the investors, because actually a lot of the investment firms look at your data themselves. They don't really rely on a lot of those rating agencies. So making sure that your bigger shareholders and the people that's vested in your company gets what they want, I think, is one of the most important things, and that's what we're focusing on. And again, focusing on the things that you can materially have an effect on.
If I may add something, I think one important thing related to this topic is the concern of investors, the paradoxes of sustainability and sustainable development, no? Because sometimes they are investing in companies that are, I don't know, helping go into a transition into a low carbon economy, but these same companies, you know, how they are operating in local context is problematic from an integrity point of view. And in my region in Latin America, we have this lithium triangle in the north of Argentina, north of Chile, south of Bolivia, where lithium is extracted, and we know lithium is a key component of batteries that go into electric vehicles. So theoretically, this is a good thing, you know, to go to the low carbon economy. But how this mineral is being extracted is a key question. No? Are we impacting local communities? Are we polluting local environments? Are we producing water scarcity? So the great concern for investors that are investing in these companies extracting these minerals, and there are many types of companies, state-owned companies from Asia, from Latin America, from Australia, from the US. It's a key concern. No? And, but we have seen, yesterday it was announced by Samantha from Morton from Power from the USAID about this Green Minerals Initiative. So I think this is the right way to go, but I think it's important to think, I mean, how are we helping sustainable development in an ethical or an unethical way?
Yeah, because so they are concerned about the environmental and social issues, but they are not thinking in that triangle that can be like the Bermudas in terms of corruption. So you have to, they should be asking the ethical questions. Yeah.
So I have a question, Anita. Given the complexity that, I mean, this is a really good example. We need the end product, or we're not going to be able to meet the targets that we all care about in terms of the future of our Earth, right? But to get there, we have to work with some kind of transition of those people doing the extracting. You're on a college campus, and I know I'm a trustee of a university, and one of the pressures in all of this are these young people who God bless, you know, really are driving us, I think, to a better place as a society. But there's not instant results. And I think all the things we're talking about up here take a progression. They don't happen overnight. You don't change values overnight, but you also don't move a company from being, you know, dependent on certain elements to being green overnight either. So what do we do in terms of bringing society along with this transformation and transition?
I think it's by not avoiding these discussions, right? So it's about connecting the dots, back to Delia's point, and actually the National Natural Resource Governance Institute is sort of focusing now on critical minerals and corruption, right? So it's about sort of packaging this as a narrative story around how these things are connected, but also educating young people that there are trade-offs, right? And that in terms of that transition, that you have to sort of figure out and have a plan, right? I think what we're saying here is ESG is just one tool that sort of helps us raise the flag where there are issues that companies or industries need to address. That's really all it is, and investors are the ones that can use those indicators to push for change. So it's really about educating young people about what ESG is and how you use it and what it means to then engage with the private sector. College students and young people around the world, you know, want us to move out of a fossil fuel economy and very quickly into green, but may not be aware that these other issues exist. So it's really about educating them about the fact that the green economy has as many challenges as where we are now.
Yeah, I live with a focus group on a constant basis. I have 9 grandchildren, 4 are in college, the others are on the way, so I get this all the time. In the back, please. And if there's, I don't know who's monitoring the online, but I would encourage if anybody is listening in and they have a question to put it forward.
Hi, James Cohn from Transparency International Canada. Hey, Delia. You've seen me. 2 questions. One on the investor community. Is there, and this is for anybody on the panel, is there an ability to change investors from passively receiving individual corporate ESG reports to, if they're so serious about this change that they want to see, basically doing the reverse of what Texas is doing to the ESG investors, using their collective power or collective action to use their money to say, we will only invest in your jurisdiction if the regulatory requirements meet the ESG standards that we want to see. And that ties into my second question about, you know, that point of the E, the S, and the G don't always play well together. And rare earth minerals are an example of that. You mentioned that things don't go fast, maybe in progress, but in regression they go very fast. And in Ontario and Quebec, 2 provinces in Canada, post-COVID, the idea to get the economy going again and tap into green energy, there's been rollbacks of community consultations in both jurisdictions in the spirit of we need green minerals to solve climate change. But that doesn't play well with the S and the G of governance and oversight and accountability, and we already have horrible environmental assessment standards in both provinces. So I don't know, maybe from Hentie and Klaus, your perspectives on companies don't always want to play politics. You want straightforward, this is how the E, the S, and G work, this is good business. But inevitably that play together, the E, the S, and the G, does kind of get into politics. Have you thought through, I know you just said this is all new for all of us, but is there thinking through how to get through that kind of messiness?
I can take the collective action one quickly. So I think the issue of collective action, I mean, there's 2 things, right? One is that investors, especially socially responsible investors, have been thinking about how to target critical sectors and problems collectively for some time. So we see that. But in terms of a particular jurisdiction or market, one of the best examples relates to forced labor in the cotton sector in Uzbekistan, right? Where investors really worked over a sustained period of time to get companies to withdraw, right? And as a result of that, that led the government and the World Bank and others to come up with a way to sort of provide a chance for re-entry, right? So now, you know, apparel companies are back in and sourcing from Uzbekistan again. You're seeing that same type of collective action now around companies that are still in Russia. Much bigger challenge. So I would just say that the ability of investors to kind of move the market and change a jurisdiction really depends a lot on the geopolitics and the sort of size of that market, right? Uzbekistan versus a Russia or China, right? Because there's similar efforts with respect to China as well, with respect to cotton and forced labor, but it's going to be a much more complex market. But collective action, absolutely.
And maybe from my side, just a thought. I go to a lot of these types of events, and involved in quite a lot of outreach, collective action kind of initiatives. But maybe I'm wrong, but honestly I don't see a lot of participation from the investment community into things like this. And maybe that's a gap, that we need to kind of look at, is how do we pull them into these kind of discussions as well? Because it's all good and well, we talk with one another here, but they are very important stakeholders as part of that as well.
And my experience with them is they're having their own discussions like this, and they do care about this, at least the more progressive ones, and there is not crossover. People, this is I think true of a lot of things where everybody is talking to themselves. And I think, if the people here are united by the anti-corruption, then the audience that gets attracted are the people, how many of you all know each other from before? And I think it's the same thing on something like this. We have to find a way to cross over.
And then just to, the other question from James in terms of how companies, you see both, and we, as I said, we're an engineering company. We are active in the mining industry, and we were actually, we were looking at what is sustainable revenue and what's not, trying to figure out where does that fit in, and actually, we brand ourselves as sustainable mining. So we provide solutions or expertise to our clients, so the clients being the mining companies of the world, the Rio Tintos, the Barricks, and so forth, to support them in whatever extractive kind of project that they're doing, that they do it in the most effective way, because it has to get done. For us to move over to do that transition from fossil to green, there needs to be still mines around in order to do that. So how do we do that in the most sustainable way? So I think as long as companies are transparent in terms of what are they doing to support the sustainability of those not so sustainable industries, and you could put that for oil and gas and those types of things as well, because they need to transition out of that, and they need engineering expertise in order to do that. So you need to support them with that. But you need to be transparent, I think, in terms of that story to make sure that people, again, education, it's all about education, making sure people understand, as a company, what do you stand for and what are you supporting them with.
Yeah, but in terms, sorry,
Please, go ahead.
in terms of explaining how sustainable you are as a company and what are you doing to be sustainable, the company should include the G. Because without the G, you are not sustainable. You can do wonderful things in terms of environment and some things in terms of human rights, social, etc. But if you are cheating, bribing, and capturing the state, which is what is happening in terms of mining in many countries in Latin America and Africa, well, exactly. You are not sustainable. You are greenwashing, which is one of the problems with these things.
So we have 15 minutes left, and we have a lot of questions. And what I'd like to do is group the questions, if we can, to make sure that we're getting as many people in as possible. So why don't you say what your question is, and if anybody's question is similar, jump onto it, and we'll get it answered, and then we'll go to the next batch.
So Margery, I'm just responding to your point about talking to investors and having that kind of crossover and dialogue. So I'm shamelessly going to plug our session on Saturday at 2:30, which is not ideal timing for a conference, but I represent British International Investment, the UK's DFI. We're going to have us talking and other investors exactly on this point. How do we ensure that anti-corruption conversation and the G gets properly factored into impact investing? So
I withdraw my comment from before. That's fantastic. Great.
Thanks.
Okay, you have a question. I can't see behind the pillars.
I'm behind the pedestal here, the pillar. And very brief comment, and this one is on the issue of...
That's one. Thanks.
Okay. Oh, sorry, Scott Hansen from the International Federation of Accountants. This is just a brief statement about the G being left behind and sort of data to back up the fact that it is indeed being left behind. As the International Federation of Accountants, we're of course interested very much in corporate reporting and audit and assurance on that reporting. So we've looked into ESG reporting and how many companies are doing it, how many companies are reporting different things, and are they getting that information audited. Almost all the big companies in the world are reporting climate, GHG, things like that. A few less are reporting environmental stuff, a few less are reporting social stuff. But when you get to G, the number drops off dramatically on the reporting side to like 75%. Almost everybody's reporting GHG. 75% of the largest companies are reporting environmental versus 75% reporting G. When you get down to the audit of that information, the G collapses. Only 50% of companies that are reporting any G information are getting that information audited. And that's not corruption specifically, that's any G information. So everyone's taking greenhouse gas seriously, everyone's taking environmental seriously, but when it comes down to the reporting around G issues, it's just not there on the same level of seriousness.
So my mistake was saying the investors aren't in the room. I think
they aren't.
Okay.
Yeah.
You had one.
Yeah, thank you. Patrick Dykmans from Code and Transparency. Just a quick thing on before my question on regarding investors. I've been fortunate enough to be to COP26 and COP27 and a couple of climate weeks in New York. So I was a little bit disillusioned with how institutional investors handle carbon. And that you have this block of investments and they see carbon and they just move it away from that carbon. And I think the G component, in a way, companies, when they're exposed to whatever things, like for example, what happened in Brazil, like they just de-invest because that's too hot. But they're not concerned when it's not published. So that's just to comment on that component. And also regarding those experiences in those events, I think there are some key players missing in these sort of events, and those are the local entrepreneurs, the local leaders in the Global South. They don't, for whatever reason, be it that they're not aware or they're not invited or they just don't care, but down the supply chain, when you go down enough, those are the actual guys that are mostly doing the, you might say, shady things. Those are the guys that are actually making a living, extracting from the environment. Those are the guys that are, I won't say killing, but in a way responsible for those impacts in societies that are living below poverty line. So just to say a demand of, you have to be more responsible with the supply chain and bring them aboard, because they are not aware of these discussions and they are important player for these changes to happen.
Okay, I think you were next, and then
thank you.
Wall, and then there's one more back there. I think that's all we'll have time for.
My name is Susan Cote-Freeman, and I'm the chair of TI Canada and a member of the board of TI. And I just wanted to actually respond to your comment on the lack of reporting on corruption. Many years ago, Transparency International worked with the Big Four to develop an auditable standard for corruption, for anti-corruption. And in the end, the accountants, we developed it with them, and then their risk committee decided that they couldn't do it because it was too risky for the profession. So there is a flaw there in the sense that we, and an auditable standard would provide a lot of reassurance to many audiences. So it's quite a gap, I think. And I had a quick comment for Mr. Moosmayer, a question. There is, I think it was about a year ago, they established the International Sustainability Standards Board. And the purpose of that is to actually try to rein in the plethora of standards. And I was wondering whether you're hopeful that it will do this and you see it as a useful development.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I mean, SASB is integrating into ISB. We have still GRI. I mean, these are still topics we need to sort out, but ISB is definitely a hope that we get the standards unified. What the rating agencies with their own standards will then do is another question, but ISB works with the regulators which makes the laws. And again, I just, before we hand over to the colleague, I just want to make one comment again. I mean, when we talk about blacklisting countries, companies, there has to be a rule of law. Again, we have environmental standards where we as Novartis are top-ranked or low-ranked. Everything, depending what you do. So before we shame and blame, we need really the rule of law, right? We need unified standards, good regulation, enforcement, absolutely. Because if not, it becomes totally discretionary. And especially when we say, let's not invest in this country anymore, not invest in this company anymore, and this sector anymore. This has to be based on facts and figures and on regulation. Sorry for this.
So Klaus, before we lose that thought, I think it might be interesting, just you can all be thinking about this as we take the other questions. Maybe we close with your wish or your, if you could project into the future, what can we do to move toward a better set of standards that is more encompassing of what we want to do and protects us, moves toward good governance. I won't even go into anti-corruption, but helps to protect and preserve the E and the S and what we need to do. So maybe you'll each have an idea that we can put together and we leave here with some tangible steps to go forward. And if you in the audience have other thoughts about that, we should talk about that as well. So you had a question.
Yes, thank you. Ryan Garul, I'm the Policy Director at the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FAC Coalition. One thing we've noticed, both with respect to the entire event, but as well as this panel, is the kind of glossing over of the importance of tax in the ESG metrics and in creating sustainable profits, as have been mentioned several times in this panel in particular, but also as it relates to funding sustainable development and helping to make sure that those processes are engaged in a responsible manner in developing jurisdictions, and not just in the United States, but all over the world. So I guess I'm just curious as to the panelists' thoughts on the importance of tax as an important component of ESG. I know it's complicated and people's eyes start to gloss over as soon as you mention tax, but certainly we think it plays an important role. Everyone has a thought on that.
So I'll leave that with the panelists, if anybody wants to comment.
I agree.
Why don't we get to the next? Okay, we all agree. Next question.
Ken Okamura, so University of Oxford. ESG indices, there are 6 major providers. As it happens, 4 of them produce a measure on anti-corruption. The correlation coefficient on it is 0.18. Several of them are negative. Turns out sustainable finance, supply chains, they have very, very high correlations. What should be in that indicator that would actually make people do what you want them to do?
Anybody have a response to that?
Wonderful. I mean, first of all, what is not a good indicator for anti-corruption, what is currently the only indicator, is how many legacy compliance issues the company had, and how many times you are in the newspapers, which they do with the artificial intelligence-based search machines, because this is normally not the current company status, this is only the past. And if you get a fine in 2020, going back to corporate conduct in 2010, if I would be an investor, I would ask what is happening now in the company and not 10 years ago. I think this is the issue we need to tackle, and we tried with Norges Bank Investment and the Bank Institute to come up with 17 indicators. Measure culture. Is there tone from the top? What do the companies publish on investigation, on their training efforts? Right? What are cultural indicators? Do the companies survey the ethical culture? You can measure this. I mean, you can measure anti-corruption KPIs as well, and this is the actual conduct and not the legacy issue of an FCPA violation in 25, which comes then to light in 2015 and is finally investigated or punished in 2020.
No, well, I think not actually only that, it works counter. I think what you're saying is that when we look backward, it's. I've had this discussion also with with Pachi. I think that it's important to give people a path forward and to encourage good behavior and not to continue to go backward and punish bad behavior. I mean,
so as a former banking regulator, I agree with Klaus, which is that a risk-based approach to assessment of the risk is what you need to do. I'm used to safety and soundness and looking at internal controls, mechanism, and supervision. I think we can do it, and it sounds like at Oxford, you're well placed to do just that.
And having many cases or many reports or many sanctions doesn't mean that that company or country is corrupt, because probably they are doing investigations because they prevent corruption, detect on time, and proceed. But that question has also to do with the measurement of corruption. So many cases is an indicator of corruption in a country? No, because probably the country is efficient in detecting and transparently reporting.
Absolutely.
And there are others, companies or countries, that have complete secrecy, no independent judiciary, no resolutions, no scandals, because they don't investigate.
So it sounds like you're already answering the last question, because we're getting some very, I think, spontaneous response here, because I also feel like sometimes parts of government that punish people for self-reporting is such a ridiculous notion. If you're going to, what's the incentive to self-report if you know that you're going to be punished? I mean, not that you shouldn't pay for your sins, but you know what I'm saying. All right, we are just about out of time. We have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to do speed dating a little bit. And I think we'll just go down the line. And if you can maybe leave us with one thought, your wish for the future here, maybe we can help them come true.
Super. Shall I go?
So you want to start?
So ISSB, you know, they are busy. They are asking for public feedback. So I think it's kind of up to us, you know, to provide them with that feedback. I've been in discussions because there's a head, they've got one of the locations in Montreal. So get engaged, you know, and get in front of what we want in that framework.
I subscribe that, and I would say that we have to take into account that ESG is not only a reporting mechanism or a tool for investors to assess where to put the money. It's also what Anita says, a standard that can be used in order to have sustainable future or companies that work sustainably, including the G.
Thank you.
Yes, and from my side, I think it's important to go beyond self-reporting information, self-disclosures information to assess a company's ESG performance. If you're an investor or you're a consumer or representing banks that are financing a project of the companies, I think it's important to have a 360 overview of the company's ESG performance based on external sources of data. There are many geospatial analytics companies, you know, that measure the carbon emissions of certain projects, that measure the pollution of certain places, also reputation risk information that what NGOs are reporting on ESG risk incidents related to companies, etc. I think that's a key part, because we in order to have an overview of how the company is really affecting its stakeholders, it's important to have access to that type of information. And one last thing, I think corporate boards should also have access, or try to make an effort to have these channels of information outside of their own companies, you know, because when they make accountable senior management for what they are doing, reporting the ESG performance of the company, in that way they will be make sure that they are listening to their external stakeholders.
And if I can amend what you're saying, just one little piece, yes. I would say, and make it available to people that are recruiting for the board. So people know what they're getting into, and when they sit on that board, know they have some responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
Klaus?
Yeah, I would hope and wish for ESG legislation, which is first of all risk-based, which has a big focus on impact rather than on just checking the box and over-reporting, and which is established in a dialogue between everyone, investors, companies, civil society, to come to the right legislation.
So I first wish for Oxford to come up with a new standard relating to corruption, and but no,
you heard it here first. Okay,
yeah, so
remember
seriously,
that.
That's right. So when we next convene, there'll be a panel discussing it. But I think and agree with Klaus on regulation. We may not agree about what goes into regulation, but I think that as we look at the European Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, but I would say key elements, not only sort of harmonized regulation, but we need directors' duties. I think this is essential. Again, maybe my corporate colleagues wouldn't agree. And also administrative sanctions as well as civil liability. So you need other ways for individual groups or people to also enforce and keep companies accountable.
Well, I think this has been an excellent panel, and I think you all bring something unique to the table. And hopefully what we have gotten from this over the next year will be incorporated into the broader thinking, and we can come back and celebrate some of the accomplishments we've made today. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Margery.